Amen. Beloved, I greet you in the words of the Apostle John. How great is the love that the Father has lavished on us that we should be called the children of God. But that is what we are. And so I'm liberated and I find affirmation in that truth as I minister the word. And so I want to invite you to our primary text is 1 John chapter 3, verse 16 and following. And before we get into the heart of the message, I just want us to step into the sandals of the Apostle John and kind of look through his lens just for a moment. John is 50 years removed from the cross, and all of his companions have given their lives for the sake of the gospel. And so I think it puts an emphasis on his first words in the first verse that he says, that which was from the beginning, that which we have heard, that which we have seen with our own eyes, that which we have looked upon, that which we have touched and handled with our own hands. So John has been through so much. He has witnessed the fires of Nero upon the church and lived through it. And at this time, as he writes, the letter is said to be written about 85 to 95 AD. And so Domitian is ruling right now. And so chronologically, he would already return back from exile where he got the revelation from Jesus Christ concerning the condition of the seven churches, right, in that region. And one in particular would be the church at Ephesus. And if you remember, what did Jesus say concerning that church? I know your deeds. You have persevered. You have worked hard. You have not tolerated wicked men. And you have tested those who claim to be apostles but are not. But are not. And he says this, I have one thing against you, Ephesian church, that you have forsaken your first love. And so I find it striking that one prominent theme that John lifts up is the agape love of God demonstrated through Jesus Christ, but also the love of God marking the children of God. And so the church at this point right here, there is a growing presence of Gnosticism, which they would teach that their actions in the flesh are not sinful, that the flesh is inherently evil. So they would not understand the gravity of the incarnation of Jesus Christ, so they would push back against it, right? And also that Jesus Christ did not come in the flesh. And so these things would actually begin to creep inside the church and inside the hearts and the minds of the believers. And so John knows this. And so I don't think it's his primary reason for writing the letter. I think it's more fellowship when you read through the chapter. And he says this in the first chapter. He says, so that you too may have fellowship with the Father and the Son. Right? Fellowship through the blood of Jesus. Fellowship through actually walking in the light of his commandments. But also this, the hindrance of that fellowship, whether it be from the love of the world, the influence of their deeds and their doctrine. And so the purpose of the message this morning is very simple. It is to lift up the agape love of Jesus Christ so that we as disciples could be compelled by that love, when we need it, reassured by that love, that it would cause us to walk with an unwavering confidence before the Lord. And so Bryce will come and cover verses 16 through 18, and he will identify the love of God and how it should compel us. Brother, come preach the word.
I'm really honored to be here this morning. Again, the primary text we're going to be focusing on is in 1 John chapter 3, and I'll be focusing on 16 through 18. And we're going to be identifying how John defines agape love and how that love should compel us. Let's begin with verse 16. Look at the verse with me. Verse 16, John says this. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. And we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. Notice how John begins the verse. Notice he immediately begins with the phrase, this is how we know what love is. Remember, John is writing to a group of Christians who are immersed and bombarded by the influence of Gnosticism. And so they are hearing all these so apparent different truths about Jesus, who he is, and what he has done. And so that brings us to verse 16 when John says, this is how we know what love is. The word love in the text is the word agape. And so we have to keep in mind that John is going to present before us an example that is qualified to embody that of agape love. So what kind of example does he present? Well, he presents the example of Jesus and his sacrifice on the cross. Look at the verse again with me. Verse 16, he says, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. Why does he do this? I would propose that it's because John understands that Jesus' sacrifice on the cross is the chief example of love. John is saying that we know love by and because of Jesus and his sacrifice. Notice he doesn't say that they know love because of anyone else's example. He doesn't say that they know love because of anything he has said or done to them. He doesn't say that they know love because of anything they have accomplished, but rather he is saying that they know love because of Jesus and Jesus alone. Why? It's because the love to which John is talking about, the love of Jesus when he laid down his life for us, agape love is a love that mankind had no concept of before Jesus directly showed us himself. Bryce, what are you saying? I am saying that because John presents Jesus' sacrifice as being solely responsible for us knowing what love is, then we have to conclude that before that point in history, before Jesus, before the cross, that we as humans did not know love. We did not know agape. So what do we learn from this verse about agape love? We learn first and foremost that agape love begins specifically with Jesus. We learn that agape love is curated by Jesus. Jesus is the curator, the creator, the originator of agape love. We learn that before Jesus laid down his life for us, that we had no concept of agape love, let alone the ability to practice it. We learn that agape love begins and ends with Jesus. This verse is twofold, though. John does something that is very important. He doesn't just present agape love as coming directly from the cross of Christ, but he also presents the compelling response that comes as a result of one who experiences the love of God. Verse 16 ends with John saying, "And we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters." What is John doing here? And why does he include this? This word ought here in the text is the word obligated. So why is John telling them that they are now obligated to lay down their lives for each other? Is John saying that this is something Christians must do as some chore for each other or some rule? No. John is not saying that this is a chore that Christians must do out of obligation, but rather he is highlighting the compelling effect that Christ's love has on the Christian. What am I saying? I am saying that John understands very clearly what it is like to be loved by Jesus. John walked, talked, touched Jesus. He knows firsthand the compelling effects that Jesus had on his life. John knows that when one experiences the level of love that Christ displays on the cross, that they are then different because of that. John knows what it's like to have his feet washed by Jesus. John is saying that because one experiences agape love from Christ, they are then as a result motivated, moved, and compelled to replicate that love towards one another. This is not an obligated response that is done begrudgingly by the Christian, but rather it is a natural reaction to the love of Christ that one has when they accept the love of Christ that He has shown them. So what do we learn about agape love from this? We learn that agape love compels us. And we learn that Jesus' sacrifice on the cross produces a response in the Christian. We learn that agape love is a love that is compelling. So now that we have seen agape love in verse 16, and specifically with the example of Jesus, let us now look at verse 17 to see what John also defines agape love as. Specifically what he says it is not. Here in verse 17, this is what John says. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need and has no pity on them, how can the love of God abide in them? Here in verse 17, we are able to clearly know what love is not. Notice how John asks a question. He asks them, how can the love of God abide in somebody who sees their brother or sister in need and yet has no pity on them, or in other translations, has no compassion on them? John's question is very revealing. He isn't asking them this question in a condescending tone or fashion, but rather it is a question pregnant with love and affection. Through this question, John is highlighting the incompatible nature of love and how that love of God cannot coexist in the same heart of one who lacks mercy or lacks compassion. Bryce, what are you saying? I am only saying what John himself is saying, and it is this, that those who have no pity or have no compassion, or other translations will use the phrase, closes their heart to their brothers in need, are those who do not have the love of God in their life. What is John doing in verse 17? He is making it very clear that agape love that comes from Christ is not the kind of love that leads the Christian to withdrawing or withholding their mercy or compassion, but rather it is the type of love that leads the Christian to extend their mercy and extend their compassion. Remember, John is contending and competing with the influence of Gnosticism. And so in verse 16, he lifts up the example of the cross, and here in 17, he is bringing them to see the unmixable nature between God's love and the lack of compassion. John, early in the chapter, in verse 12, will present the example of Cain killing his brother Abel out of his hatred for him. And in verse 12 of chapter 3, John will say, Cain belonged to the evil one. And it was because the love of God was not in Cain. So what is the picture we see here in 17? Verse 17. We are seeing John emphasize this same point. He is emphasizing that one belongs to God when they are living out and extending the love of God to their fellow brother or sisters in need. But those who withdraw their love and withhold their mercy from their fellow brothers or sisters in need do not belong to God, but rather, like Cain, belong to the evil one. This is why John in verse 19 will go on to say, this is how we know that we belong to the truth. We know that we belong to God and that His love resides within our hearts by how we love each other. This is the same thing when Jesus tells His disciples, they will know that you are my followers by how you love one another. So what do we learn about agape love in verse 17? We learn that agape love cannot coexist or live in the same realm of one who lacks mercy and lacks compassion towards the brother or sister in need. We learn that agape love is directly correlated to mercy and compassion. We learn that those who practice agape love belong to God, but those who do not practice agape love do not belong to God. We have seen John define love in verse 16 and with Jesus himself, and then in 17 he describes what love is not. And so what does he say about agape love in verse 18? What does he say agape love looks like? Look at verse 18 with me. He says this, "Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with action and in truth." What can we learn about agape love from this verse? What is John saying agape love is through this verse? John, up to this point, has been painting this picture of agape love. And so here he is charging the Christian hearers. He charges them to not love with words or speech, but with actions and truth. What does this mean? Why is John saying this? John is he saying that we shouldn't love each other with our words or with our speech? No, John isn't saying we shouldn't affirm each other or lift each other up with kind words or kind speech. But what John is saying is that that alone is not enough. That alone is not agape love. Essentially, what John is saying is that talk is cheap. John understands that agape love that comes from Christ is more than the kind of love that just tells you of its love, but rather it's the kind of love that shows you its love. Again, think of the example of Jesus himself. Verse 16, Jesus didn't just tell us he loved us, he showed us he loved us. He showed us. But it is also important to note that John doesn't just say to love with actions, but also in truth. What does it mean to love each other in truth? To love each other in truth means to love each other genuinely, with authenticity. Again, think of the example of Jesus. Jesus didn't go to the cross out of frustration and spite and hatred towards his people, but he went to the cross out of love and compassion and affection for his people. There's a major difference. He's making a difference between words and speech and its shallow nature and action and truth and its substance and it's how it's deeper than just the previous. So what is the point here? The point is this. If Bryce is claiming to love my brother, if I'm claiming to love Michael and to love God, then my life will be in service to my brother in need out of my affection, love, and compassion towards them. We learn that agape love is directly associated with action. It is not a passive love. It is an active and engaging love. It is a love that doesn't stop at just the talk of love, but rather it extends to the point of showing you its love. We learn that there's a difference of quality between loving each other in speech and tongue and with actions and truth. So I challenge you, I charge you to take this and be compelled to live out the love of Christ towards one another. Why can we do that? Because Christ first loved us. How can we do that? It's simple. For the disciples, it was Jesus washing their feet and laying down his life for them. And maybe that's what it is for us as well. But what it is for us is finding our brother and sister in need, finding what their immediate need is, and saying, I'm not going to just tell you I love you. I'm not going to just tell you I'm praying for you. I'm going to show you I love you because I affectionately have a compassion towards you. I love you as my brother and as my sister, so I'm going to help you meet that need. Again, in verse 16 through 18, we identified what agape love is and how it compels us. And so now our brother Michael will preach 19 through 24 and how we can be reassured to walk confidently with our God. Thank you.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Bryce. Me and Bryce have spent some time uh, living out that sacrificial love towards one another, and it is a great honor. Beloved, know this that it is an honor to live from a place of indebtedness to your brother with a sense of obligation. Why? Because he first loved us. But it doesn't actually stop there, because in the next verses in John, in 19 through 20, John would say this. This is how we know that we belong to the truth and how we set our hearts at rest in his presence. And whenever our hearts condemn us, God is greater than our hearts and he knows everything about us. So it's twofold. Walking in the agape love of Jesus Christ shows that you actually belong, but then it does something for our very essence, our very soul, the very intent and the motives of our hearts, actually putting us in a posture of rest before him in his presence. Just looking at verse 19, when he uses the word belong, it means to be married to something, to be congruent with something, to be in possession of something, or to be that possession of the one you actually belong to. When you actually look through the letter of John, he uses we know over 42 times. We know. This is how you know this. As a matter of fact, he says that I write to you not because you don't know the truth, but because you actually know. And so John is all about reaffirming and reassuring the Christian that that which they belong to, being Jesus Christ, that that truth is reliable. At rest in his presence, to rely upon, to find trust in. And what's so remarkable when he says at rest in his presence, it's twofold. That our God has a presence to be lived before in, but also his presence living inside of us. John would later on speak to that in verse 24. But then John, it strikes me his next words. I would think he would go into maybe how lavished we are, but then he speaks to the condition of our hearts, and he says, whenever our hearts condemn us, God is greater than our hearts, and he knows everything. We got to ask the question, what could be condemning the Christians that John are writing to? Could it be maybe the love of the world that is maybe influencing the church? Could it be maybe the lust of the flesh that is beginning to stir within the appetite of the Christian? Could it be perhaps the lust of the eye that's making it appeal? Or maybe the pride of life. Maybe they're thinking, emptying my life out to the glory of Jesus Christ on behalf of my brothers, maybe that's not enough. Or maybe they're lacking in that place of zeal and passion for their brother. He uses that word condemn to find fault with, or worthy of blame, or to think ill of. But the hope in that verse is that God knows everything about us, and he's greater than our hearts. For us, it would take us back to that if any one of us does sin, and we have an advocate, Jesus Christ, the righteous one. And so his blood actually cleanses us as we walk into the light. And so the next verse in 21, John actually turns the corner, and I believe that this is a word of affirmation. He would say, dear friends, if our hearts do not condemn us, then we have a confidence before the Lord that whatever we actually ask from him, we actually receive it. A word of affirmation to them. When he uses the word confidence, it is in the Greek to speak with an all-out boldness, with a freeness in speech and in action. Listen to this, with a fearlessness in mind and in spirit. This would echo chapter 4 when he says, perfect love casts out all fear. In love, right? In love there's no fear. Why? Because when the love of God is manifested in us, we can be confident in the day of judgment, he would say. And so it's a liberating thing. This is the posture that John wants us to actually walk with. And when he uses the word ask, it is to request, maybe a desire of something that you are in need of. Illustration. One day my son Errol will have responsibilities as a son, right? And I will ask of him certain things he has to tend to. I would ask things that are reasonable, things that are within his capability, most of all, things that are for his well-being and his maturation as my son. Now, if Aaron tends to the things that his father asked of him, he would be what? Liberated. He would be confident. He would be reassured that whatever he asks his father, I'm going to give to him. Why? Because he's laid my instruction and my wife's instruction, right, upon his heart. But if he doesn't, he's going to be reluctant if he doesn't walk out what I've asked him to do. And so, application to us, how is it not true that we are much more freer before God when we are walking in the light, our confidence, our reassurance, our security before Him? We can trust and know that our Father will give to us. Amen. And the last verses here in closing, John says this, verse 23. And this is his command, to believe upon the name of Jesus Christ, his Son, and to love one another as he commanded. Verse 24, the one who keeps God's commands lives in him, and he in them. And this is how we know that he lives in us, by the Spirit he gave in us. Briefly, when he uses the word believe and name, again, it is to rely upon, to have faith in. When he uses the word name, it is the authority of, the reputation of Jesus Christ, the fact of what he actually did for you, so you can trust in that. And then it says this, that brings out the authority, just as he commanded us to love. Can you hear John 13 when he says, as I have loved you, you love one another. Just as, in the same manner, to the same degree, and to the one who is calling you to love. When he uses the word lives and in, it means to abide, to remain, to actually continue with. When he says in, it actually means in a relationship of rest. So this is the heart posture that John actually wants the Christian to actually walk with. And so in closing, Bryce has put before us the challenge to walk sacrificially in agape love. And so from me to you, I just leave you with something that's more reflective. Two things. If there's any insecurity that you have, whether that's through something that may be condemning us, right, that we're worthy of blame, or maybe it's just an insecurity and we have a weakness and we actually need reassurance. We actually need to own our identity in Christ and have a confidence. Whatever that is, examine that and take it before the Father. The encouragement is this, that God knows everything about us, amen, and that He is greater than our hearts. That's the encouragement. And then for us who are confident in the Lord, who are liberated in our person, then our charge is this, to find the one who is not confident. Find the brother or sister who is struggling and come alongside and be strength to them so that we can walk in the fullness of being confident before the Lord. Beloved, bless you. May the Lord keep you.